this episode of the Lifecentral Podcast, I chat with Phil Knox as we explore the evidence behind the resurrection of Jesus. So wherever and however you are tuning in, we are so glad that you could join us. This is the Lifecentral Podcast. Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to the Lifecentral Podcast. Easter is almost here, so of course we are talking all things resurrection. If you are new to or you are exploring the Christian faith, then this is going to be a great episode for you as we take a deep dive into the greatest miracle that this world has ever known. And if you already are a follower of Jesus, then this is also an episode for you. We are surrounded by friends, family, colleagues who don't yet know Jesus, and who you just might want to have some of the information we're going to talk about today in your back pocket. I'm thrilled to be joined today by the wonderful Phil Knox. Hi, Phil.
Hi, Deb. How are you?
I'm well. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. Isn't it wonderful that spring is here? It feels like it's been a long, cold, dark winter. And, as I look out my window as we record this, it's still light. There's blue in the sky. And it's great to be talking at Easter. I love Christmas, but this is just beautiful, isn't it? It's
my favourite time of year, bar none, for sure. And having that extra hour in the day is making a huge difference. Like, we may have lost an hour of sleep yesterday, but it's totally worth it for a sunshine-filled evening, for sure. Okay, well, Phil, many of the people listening to this podcast will know you for the fantastic human being that you already are. But there might be some people listening who don't know you. So it would be great if you could just introduce yourself to the listeners and just explain a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm coming to you live from about 4 miles away from Deb, just up the road in Quinton. So lived in Quinton most of my life, part of the leadership team of a local church there called St Boniface Church. You might have heard of it, Quinton Road West. And my day job is I work for a big Christian organisation called the Evangelical Alliance. We're about together making Jesus known. And within that, my job is I'm a missiologist, which means I study the pathways by which people become Christians and try to help the whole of the UK church make the most of those pathways. I have a great job hearing people's stories of how they've become Christians and then telling people about Jesus, trying to really encourage the church to make the most of the opportunities we have. And as we're about to discover a hope in this podcast, lots of people are coming to faith and there's a great spiritual hunger, and it's kind of all of our jobs to play our part within that. But I play my part locally in Quinton, but also nationally as part of the Evangelical Alliance.
It's why you're beautifully placed to be the guest on the podcast today, Phil. And fun fact, listeners, my husband used to work with Phil, so it's very nice to be able to see him again.
I miss him very much.
Likewise. So, Phil, I became a Christian when I was 15, off the back of a really important passage of scripture, which I'm going to share with you in a moment. And it's an account that I'd read many times, including, the verses in John 3:16 as well. But this one particular evening, I was reading over it again and it just it gut punched me. And that was it. That was the night I gave my life to Jesus. And I since then, and I guess until recently, hadn't really looked beyond the biblical narrative, because I was like, well, I've done my bit. But actually, it's not about me. It's my decision is made. What is important now is helping people find and follow Jesus, as we would say here in the church. And I do want to start there with the biblical account, because I think it's going to link really nicely with the first point that we talk about. So I wanted to read a few verses from Luke chapter 24, and then we'll get stuck in. But on the first day of the week at early dawn, they went to the tomb, taking the spices that they had prepared. And they found the stone rolled away from the tomb. But when they went in, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. While they were perplexed about this, behold, 2 men stood by them in dazzling apparel. And as they were frightened and bowed their faces to the ground, the men said to them, "Why do you seek the living among the dead? He is not here, but has risen. Remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee that the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men and be crucified and on the 3rd day rise." And they remembered his words. And returning from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and to all the rest. I hope as Christians that every time we read that passage of scripture, we're absolutely floored by it. just the beauty of it and the joy that it brings. But I also can see how if you are not a Christian, reading any of those passages in the Gospels, you look at that and go, that's crazy. Do you want to come in?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's I think to our modern secular minds, we are shaped by the forces around us, aren't we? And I think for most of history and for most people around the world, there's a much more open mindset to the things of the supernatural. But we in the West, we're all shaped by the kind of a product of the societies in which we're born into. And we in the West have been shaped massively over the last few hundred years by this major intellectual revolution that happened in the 18th, 19th century called the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment basically said that can things be argued rationally? Can things be measured scientifically? The principles are called rationalism and empiricism. And basically, we are shaped by that, where we kind of religion, miracles, those kind of things, supernatural events cannot be measured scientifically. And so they have been de-emphasized in our world over the last couple of hundred years. And we find ourselves today as kind of children of that revolution a couple of hundred years ago. And so that's why to kind of people across the UK today and around the Western world, the resurrection does sound crazy.
It really does. Do you think that we're growing more skeptical of miracles and the miraculous and the supernatural because of that?
Do you know, Deb, I think the opposite's true. Okay. I think interestingly at the moment, I think there's a real resurgence in interest in spiritual things. I think the part of that is that the Enlightenment kind of came alongside lots of scientific progress. And it's no kind of, you don't have to look far, do you, apart from the kind of iPhone in your pocket to see that we have seen extraordinary scientific progress. But there was this assumption that alongside scientific progress would come kind of a better world, and alongside intellectual progress would come a greater moral world that we'd be better behaved towards one another. And I don't think many people look at our world at the moment, the threat of World War III, what's happening on a local level, on a national level, on a global level. I don't think many people are looking around and going, do you know what, this world's getting loads better. Now, on lots of metrics we are, but I think on the kind of some of the deeper human needs stuff, and certainly morally, I don't think people are looking at that and going, there's been moral progress. And I think as a result of that and lots of other factors, there's this kind of openness to spiritual things at the moment. And in some ways, lots of the kind of the secular atheism of the world is crumbling a little. So, for example, a couple of weeks ago in The Independent, there was a report that said that Gen Z are far less likely to be atheists than their parents. So of under 25s at the moment in the UK, only 13% say they don't believe in God. Now, that is not only shocking to children of the Enlightenment, that's shocking now that to parents of those generations. 87%, therefore, have some belief in something other or God. Christian music listening is up 45% on last year amongst millennials and younger. Times reported recently that Bible sales between 2019 and 24 have increased by 87%. And all of these things, I think, are markers that in our culture, there's an increasing openness to spiritual things. And so therefore, this kind of the skeptical generation who would have looked at things like the resurrection maybe previously and gone, nah, I'm going to write that off. Actually, there's an openness, I think, these days. And so maybe there's something of those kind of that the progress narrative and that everything has to be rational and scientific. I think that's perhaps crumbling a little.
Yeah, with Gen Z, with millennials even, and just the rise of social media and the media in general, I think the media would have us believe that so very few of us now are engaged in any sort of spirituality, any sort of belief in a God or God. And actually, from what you're saying, the opposite is in fact true. And these trends are just flying in the face of what the media would say. But the media has a huge impact on just general rhetoric and the way that culture is formed. And I just wonder if social media and the media has a part to play in this.
Sure. And I think probably in some ways, the social media is the Wild West, isn't it? There is some really awful stuff out there. Plenty. But at the same time, I think social media also, because everyone's got a megaphone now, it means that we're all hearing lots of different voices. Now, we're hearing voices on both sides of the argument at all, and of course, and every side of the argument. But I think we're also hearing, the mainstream media is probably never really going to promote a story talking about the supernatural, because it just like the rest of us, it's a child of the Enlightenment, right? But what I'm finding really interesting at the moment, I'm not a big kind of social media consumer, but my news feed, I'm seeing an awful lot of people who have come to faith and are telling their story. So, I would say just, now and again, I'm doing that terrible thing we all do where we're scrolling. If you found this podcast scrolling, God bless you. Thank you. Keep listening. But in my scrolling, I'm also hearing people starting their little thing to video going, do you know what, guys? I've become a Christian. I saw a kind of a big kind of social media influencer who's got like millions of views, sharing he'd become a Christian recently. The co-founder of Wikipedia has recently become a Christian, and he was telling his story and has written a huge blog explaining his reasons for coming to faith. Wow. Renowned atheists who come from the academic world, they've become a Christian recently. They've been telling their story. And so I think to some extent, the kind of the social media world tells us all kinds of viewpoints, but I think it's influencing this particular area, because I think for a lot of people, there is a different narrative emerging. And I think especially as the world crumbles in lots of different ways, people are looking for hope. They're encountering Jesus and telling that story. And that's really good.
It's so true. We've talked about how, we need this rational viewpoint, and, the Enlightenment has meant that we're chasing after empirical knowledge. But this also was a crazy story at the time in which it happened for very different reasons, as you're about to share with us. But obviously the resurrection took place before the Enlightenment, but how would it have been viewed at that time?
Yeah, so as I said, when we talked about the Enlightenment, for people outside the Western world and people pre-Enlightenment, supernatural events were much more kind of part of their worldview. And so the issue for people at the time wasn't necessarily believing that someone had risen again from the dead. There was a belief in miracles and the supernatural. I guess the problem at the time was not just anyone was raising from the dead, but someone who claimed to be God. And this was a problem for people at the time in the Jewish world, in the Roman world, in the Greek world. Gods were not crucified. So the problem is less the resurrection, actually, for people. It's the fact that Jesus was crucified in the first place, because crucifixion was a humiliation for losers. The people who were crucified were slaves. They'd lost. So there's this beautiful quote from the historian Tom Holland, who he himself is on a spiritual journey, but has written this huge book called Dominion, which is this. I listened to it on Audible. It was like 23 hours of the history of the Christian faith, but was worth it for some glorious little moments. But Tom Holland's kind of premise is that we can't explain lots of phenomena in the Western world without reference to Christianity. Such has been the impact of Jesus Christ. But he writes about crucifixion. He says, divinity was for the greatest of the great, for victors and heroes and kings. Its measure, divinity's measure, was the power to torture one's enemies, not to suffer it oneself, to nail them to the rocks of a mountain, or to turn them into spiders, or to blind and crucify them after conquering the world. And then he says this of Jesus, that a man who had himself been crucified might be hailed as a god, could not help to be seen by people everywhere across the Roman world as scandalous, obscene, and grotesque. And so at the start of this podcast, as we talk about the resurrection, we have to see it from these two perspectives. Yeah. That for people who aren't followers of Jesus, either it's just bonkers, it's just crazy, it couldn't happen because these things don't happen. Or for a lot of the world, it's also bonkers, but it's also shameful that a God would go to the cross. But for us as Christians, if it's true, it's beautiful on both those levels, because it proves that Jesus is God, because he's outside the laws of nature. But it's also beautiful because God would humble himself to die the most scandalous, shameful death for us. And we'll come on to what it means later.
Yeah, we will. We've just finished a series at Lifecentral on the topic of miracles. And Andy finished off his preaching series by talking about how every world religion gets man to atone for his own sin.
Right.
that Christianity is the one world religion where God atones for man's sin. And it is, for Christians, it is beautiful. It's the most beautiful thing, that God would step out of heaven and humble himself to death on the cross and predict his own death and resurrection and pull it off. It's beautiful. It is crazy, but the most beautiful kind of crazy that there is. You know, you're right. The idea of a God dying is humiliating on the face of it. It's equally shocking. It's equally profound. But if Jesus truly rose from the dead, and of course we believe that that's true, then this moment of ultimate defeat became the greatest victory in history. So is there any other evidence that points us towards the happening of the resurrection?
Okay, so we need to be really clear here that the Christian faith stands or falls at the resurrection. You know, if Jesus didn't rise again from the dead, if it didn't happen, we may as well all go and try and be as happy as possible, or try and find fulfillment somewhere else, go and earn as much money as possible, have a nice life, because this is all we have. You know, if someone can prove to me today that the resurrection didn't happen, then I'm changing the whole direction of my life. But if it did happen, it changes everything.
Yeah.
And there's plenty of good evidence. A long time ago, I did a law degree, so I know what it is to look at evidence. And I trust those who've looked at the evidence, but I've also looked into a lot of the evidence myself. And you can read extensively. People have written throughout the centuries extensively on this. And there's a few kind of factors here to consider. The first is that we have for the resurrection a specific location and a time that sits alongside verifiable historical events and figures. So it's not a lot of myths, if you like, kind of can take place and without reference to kind of things you can point to in history and people you can point to and say that happened definitely alongside that. Then we have kind of named witnesses in several accounts written in texts that are just about the most reliable sources of events at the time. So there's been lots of work done on verifying the reliability of the accounts of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And there is no other work in the entirety of ancient history that is as reliable as those accounts. There's a process called textual criticism, which measures the number of copies and the timings of those copies of those accounts. And the Bible stands head and shoulders, like thousands of times more reliable than any other document of its time. And so we can trust that these documents haven't changed over time, that they are reliable sources, that the people who saw them, who wrote these things down, we can trust in those. And there's loads of work to be done. You can look into it yourself. You can research it yourself. And I would encourage you to do so, especially if you are kind of looking into Christianity. There's lots of really good stuff out there to look at this. There's loads of other factors. There's the fact that the disciples, put yourself for a moment into their shoes or into their sandals. You know, there are a few of them. Their leader has died, and then at that point, if Jesus was just another revolutionary, every other revolution falls when the leader dies.
Right.
But these disciples had this moment where, if Jesus didn't rise again, they should have just faded into obscurity. But instead, they go on to be part of this transformational movement that over the last 2,000 years is no longer just 12 disciples or 11 because Judas betrayed him. But now is around 2.4 billion people across the globe. The transformed lives of the disciples and the fact that, you know, that most of them died for their faith and their belief that it happened, I think is a really good reason to look into the resurrection and is really helpful evidence. And then we look into the kind of the transformed lives of people over the last 2,000 years. There are lots of people like you and me, Deb, who say, today I am different because of the resurrection of Jesus. In fact, there are 2.4 billion of those. There is something that happened 2,000 years ago that has had an impact on an awful lot of people's lives. All of those things, I think, point to a resurrected Jesus. Now, in the end, none of us, well, certainly you and me, weren't there. There is faith involved in this. But lots of people say when people become Christians, they kind of leave their brain at the door. That is not the case. No. Very, very, some of the cleverest minds on earth follow Jesus. An awful lot of clever minds have also looked into the resurrection and the evidence for it. And it's a really, really sound it's sound, solid ground that you stand on when you say, I believe Jesus rose again from the dead.
Yeah, they're not like mutually exclusive things, are they? That is the right term, isn't it? Is that the right term?
That's the right term. You can be clever and be a Christian. Yes.
Thank you. Okay, great. They're not mutually exclusive terms, are they? Like being a Christian and being able to look at empirical evidence and then make an informed decision for yourself. But I do think it's important that we acknowledge that for every bit of evidence that we could lay down here, there are going to be people who will try to refute every piece of evidence that's laid out in front of them. There's a few prominent theories, which we're going to mention in a moment, that people use as their evidence to say, well, actually, this didn't happen. And it's quite possible that, the people listening to this and myself will be in conversations where that's the case, and we're in conversations with those people. So I just wanted to ask you, how would you address those counter arguments? And have you got any tips for the listeners? If we have got to defend the faith, how do we best go about that?
Yeah, sure. And I think the first thing is, I think whenever I'm in any conversation with someone who's not yet a Christian, I'm looking for the kind of motive behind that conversation. And some people just want to have a go, but some people are genuinely searching. And I think the first thing I'd say is, if you've got a friend who's genuinely searching, point them to so there's some really good books on this. So there's things like Lee Strobel has written a book called The Case for Easter, or The Case for Christ. There's some really good research there. I'm a big fan of one called Evidence That Demands a Verdict. We're going to come on to a few more in a moment. There's some really good. So if people are genuinely interested, point them in the direction of some of these really good texts and really good people who've looked into all of the evidence. I would also say then in terms of the kind of counter arguments, there's kind of three, I would say, major arguments that I've come up against in kind of conversation. And again, I think looking at people's motive behind these, if they're really looking, actually, they will listen to you in terms of how you respond, but also respond with real grace and say, look, this is something that I really believe. I've looked at the evidence. If you haven't, I encourage you to do so as well. But also just be really kind of gracious and say, actually, there's some really good evidence to believe this. And actually, when we look at these three arguments, that's some really good kind of counter evidence pieces. So let's look at them. So the first is that some people say, well, Jesus didn't really die. Actually, what happened was he kind of just fainted on the cross and was alive the whole time. And somehow then when he's kind of taken to the tomb, he then woke up, got out, and that's how he did it. What's fascinating around this is a lot of medics have looked at this. And there's, when we look at the accounts, first of all, on the swoon theory, the Romans were very good at their job and were good at crucifying people. If your job is that you're a Roman executioner, it's pretty easy to get that right, I think, with the tools that you have available to you. But one of the really compelling pieces of evidence is that in John's account of the crucifixion, he talked about the fact that the Roman soldier plunged a spear into Jesus' side. And I mean, I would, if you're kind of completing the job, that's one way of doing it, isn't it? And what happens at that moment is that blood and water poured out of Jesus' side at that point. And that only happens, that kind of combination is, and first of all, this was at a time when they wouldn't have known this is what happens when people die. But when blood and water poured out of Jesus' side, and this, when medics have looked at this, what happens in that instance is that the kind of the fluids separate when people have a heart attack. So in terms of the way that people die on a cross, in the end, most people die of asphyxiation, because when you're being crucified, you've got nails in your wrists and you can no longer pull yourself up to breathe. Your body sags, you die of asphyxiation. But beautifully, actually, and poetically, the way Jesus dies on the cross is he has a heart attack. So poetically, you might say that Jesus died of a broken heart. Isn't that beautiful?
It is.
But actually, for the kind of the blood and water to come out, you have to have died for that to happen. So there's lots of evidence around that kind of Jesus probably did die for both those reasons. Second theory that people come up with is that the kind of body was stolen. So the body was stolen by either the Jews or the disciples or the Romans. First of all, again, the Romans were good at their job. There were soldiers guarding the tomb. We look into the kind of mental state of the disciples. Were they able to do that? But also, the most compelling piece of evidence for me here as to whether the disciples went on to the disciples stole the body, is that, again, most of these disciples went on to die for their belief in the resurrection. So if you've stolen the body, would you really be so convicted of your faith that Jesus rose again from the dead that you would choose to die for that? The fact that so many did, and no one went, oh, no, actually, we stole the body. There was that. But then the other theory around the stolen body is that maybe the Jewish authorities did, for whatever reason. When the church was exploding, they could have just produced the body and said, no, we got it. There was a kind of general acceptance amongst the Jews, the Romans, that the tomb was empty. No one produced the body. The disciples went on to die for their belief in the resurrection. And then the third theory is that kind of, I guess, if you really want something to happen, maybe you might hallucinate. You hear stories, don't you, about people who kind of see loved ones, that maybe kind of maybe the guys Luke talks about just after the passage you read. Luke talks about these two guys who were walking along the road to a place called Emmaus, and this guy came along, and this guy was Jesus. And that again, isolated incident, they could have been a hallucination. But we read throughout Scripture by people who would have been able to have their views verified by people who were around at the time and they read these original sources, that lots and lots of people saw them, including, Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 15, that 500 of the disciples saw Jesus at one time. It's highly unlikely that 500 people all have the same hallucination all at the same time. And so of those three counter arguments, there is good evidence to kind of say, I think the most likely evidence points towards that Jesus rose again from the dead.
You don't die for living a lie, right? And if you're going to shut
some might, but all of them died, right?
And if you're going to shut something down, you just shut something down, right? And 500 people, and that's 500 people to then keep a lie. If they were trying to conceal this, it just, we can't keep alive. There's three people in a room, it is really interesting. We've chatted about quite a few sources that point to the resurrection, but something that is really powerful is people's testimony. It's undoubtable. I'm floored whenever we have a baptism Sunday here at church and people explain their own unique journeys towards making a commitment to follow Jesus. And every one of those stories is beautiful and every one of those stories is unique. There are so many stories out there of people who went out to disprove that this ever happened and finished the process having given their life to Jesus. And I just wanted you to share some of that with us, because these were big figures at the time that these events happened.
Yes, it turns out if you want to meet Jesus, try and disprove the resurrection. So for example, in the 18th century, there was a guy called Gilbert West, and Gilbert was really annoyed that a lot of his mates were becoming Christians. So he gets together with some friends. He decides, I'm going to write a book to disprove the resurrection of Jesus. He looks into the evidence. Halfway through the book, he meets Jesus, and he writes his book the other way around. In the 19th century, there was an American general called General Lew Wallace. And again, I think him and maybe his wife was involved. Anyway, they were all I think his wife might become a Christian, and he's really annoyed about this. He thinks, because if you disprove the resurrection, we may as well all go home. So General Lew Wallace sets out in the 19th century to disprove the resurrection. And again, he gets about halfway through his book. He meets Jesus. His book that he wrote, he writes the other way around, and it's called Ben-Hur. And in the 20th century, there's a lawyer and a journalist called Frank Morrison. And he's a lawyer, so like me, knows how to kind of handle information and present an argument. He's also a journalist, so he's good at researching stuff. So he looks into how you disprove the resurrection. And halfway through the book of writing his research piece, he meets Jesus. And he becomes a Christian, and he writes his book the other way around, and his book is called Who Moved the Stone? And so all of those people, 18th, 19th, 20th century, there'll probably be one very soon in the 21st century, because when you look into the evidence, there is compelling scientific reports, historical evidence. And as I say, there is a step of faith involved. But you are standing on firm historical and intellectual grounds, and many people have been on that journey, I find that encouraging, because I'm not as clever probably as any of those people, but I find that encouraging, that intellectual giants. And interestingly, actually, of the people coming to faith at the moment, there's many people who are from the academic world, who are coming to faith.
I think that's important in itself, because when we're living in a world that demands empirical evidence and empirical knowledge, having these, I say educated from an academia point of view, that having these educated people go, no, actually, like I've met the risen Jesus, that might be the person that makes them take a step back and go, oh, hang on a minute, I probably should look into this. And so their testimonies become incredibly powerful for people who are skeptical about this. And, the fact that many skeptics set out to disprove the resurrection, but ended up convicted by it instead, raises an important question for me. If this evidence is so compelling, we believe that it is, why then does faith and belief in the resurrection seem to be declining in places like the UK? If the media is to be believed, are we living in a post-Christian era, as people might want to suggest? I mean, do you even agree with that?
I mean, first of all, as I said earlier, let's grab a global perspective, right? So we like to think we're the only country on earth sometimes, but on a global level, there are 2.4 billion followers of Jesus. By 2050, I think that'll be 3 billion followers of Jesus. There are places around the world, in places like China and Iran, interestingly, where authorities are trying to squash the church, where there's just explosive growth. And globally, atheism is in decline. We talked about the Enlightenment earlier. Atheism's in decline globally. I think that's really exciting.
Let's celebrate that.
Now, in the UK, it's slightly nuanced. People will have seen, listening to this, will have seen the kind of the census results, talking about the fact that the last census, for the first time in recent history, those who identify as Christians was below 50% for the first time in living memory. Now, I think there's a nuanced view that we need on this. First of all, that nominalism is declining. By nominalism, I mean people who kind of tick a box to say, I identify as being a Christian, but they don't read their Bible, don't go to church, wouldn't say that I'm a disciple of Jesus. Practicing Christianity is holding steady, if not slightly growing. So those people like you and me, Deb, who say we are sold out for Jesus, that's not in decline. There are also, as we've talked about, those signs to be massively encouraged by, about a kind of an increased spiritual hunger. Now, I think the other interesting thing here is that just because people are less likely to identify as religious and identify as belonging to a certain faith doesn't mean they don't believe in anything, or indeed the resurrection. So there was a piece of research in 2022 called Talking Jesus. And Talking Jesus kind of asked people in the UK, they talked to almost 4,000 people across the UK, big piece of research done by a research company called Comres, who people might have heard of. And they asked people, do you believe in the resurrection? 45% of people in the UK believe in the resurrection of Jesus. And so the issue isn't necessarily that whether people believe it or not, because a lot of our neighbours, a lot of people believe that Jesus rose again from the dead. The question is kind of how relevant is that to our lives today?
Well, we're about to come on to talk about that, because it does all boil down to this conversation that we've been having on the resurrection. Like you said earlier, if this didn't happen, then what are 2.5 billion people around the world even doing? Let's go home. But if it is everything, and It is everything. So as we come towards the end of our episode, what does the resurrection mean for us as Christians? What does it mean for those exploring the Christian faith? It's interesting you say that about how, we don't necessarily not believe that the resurrection happened. It's what's relevant to us. So obviously my next question has to be, how do we make it relevant? Because if this is the crux of the issue, we need to have some things in our back pocket that we can use in those conversations with our nearest and dearest.
Yeah, I think the way we make it relevant is by telling stories. I think we talk about the stories of how this has impacted us. But also we talk about the fact that Jesus is alive today, right? If you're walking down a road and you come to a crossroads and there's two men lying down in front of you and you don't know which way to go, and one of them's dead and one of them's alive, I know which one I'm asking for directions. And Jesus is alive. And I think, we interviewed a load of people, part of our research at the EA last summer, and we interviewed almost 300 people and asked them their story of how they'd become a Christian. And the stories are so beautiful. I was sat on a train actually when I first read the report, and there were business people all over the place, and I just wept because the stories of people meeting Jesus. Stories are so powerful. So I'd encourage you, if you've got people who are skeptical about how the resurrection impacts life today, being able to tell our story, I think is the best way of doing that.
Yeah, I'm so passionate about people's testimonies that there is not a baptism Sunday that goes by where I'm not absolutely weeping in my chair. Like the things that Jesus does, the way that he meets people in their own individual circumstances, it's just incredible. But it does all boil down to this, doesn't it? Like what we've been talking about over the last few minutes is, if this didn't happen, then what are we even doing? 2.5 billion people around the world. Let's go home, as you said already. But the resurrection is everything. So as we come towards the end of our episode, Phil, what does the resurrection mean for us as Christians? And what does it mean for those exploring the Christian faith? Because both of those groups of people might be listening.
Yeah, I would say this Easter, the cross and the resurrection boil down to two things. First of all, it proves that we're loved. And secondly, it gives us hope for the future. And so let's look at that love thing to start with. I just think the cross is the most extravagant gesture of love to a world that lives in a vacuum and a poverty of unconditional love. I don't know about you, Deb. I just need to know that I'm loved. I've experienced, in recent months, I've been quite discouraged. I've been quite down. It means the world to me that God would die for me. I need a shepherd for the valleys of life. Right. There's that famous those verses in the Bible in Psalm 23 that it's this kind of song, the Lord is my shepherd. If you're West Brom, might be West Brom fans at Lifecentral, you love West Brom, the Lord is my shepherd. But halfway through that, it says, even though I walk through the darkest valley, I'll fear no evil, for you're with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. The fact that God knows that whatever, however much pain we feel, whatever we've walked through, I don't know, anyone listening to this, whatever you're walking through at the moment, the cross and the resurrection prove that Jesus walks through the darkest valley with you. I don't know why we live in such a world of pain and suffering. You need a different apologist on a different episode for that. Don't know why my parents' lives have been cut short. Don't know why so many things. I think it's Leon, your pastor, who says we don't get the life we hoped for. I don't know, but I do know that God is with us. Yeah. And when we walk, those words are written, and walks about talking about we walking through the darkest valley, the cross and the resurrection of Jesus prove that God not only walked through the darkest valley with us, feels separation from all the comforts and all that he's ever known, suffers the most agonizing physical death, but also wins in the end. And that comfort and that love, the Bible says repeatedly that we know how much God loves us because he would die for us. And so the first encouragement about the cross and the resurrection is that we know that we're loved. And the second is that the resurrection gives us hope that everything will be all right in the end. As I look at my news feed at the moment, Deb, I'm sure you're the same. It's just the worst news than I've faced any other point in my lifetime. And I think we're all asking the question, is it going to be all right? Is it going to be all right?
It's constant. It's one thing after another. I just stopped reading in the end. We need it.
And I've got, as you know, I've got a 12-year-old son, and I'm educating him in lots of ways. I'm teaching him the way of Jesus. I'm teaching him the way of Aston Villa, which I will divide the room over, or the podcast. But I'm also teaching him the way of James Bond. We're watching the James Bond films together.
Nice.
Recently, we were watching Goldfinger, and there's this moment during Goldfinger where James Bond's about to be cut in half by a laser, and Bond says to Goldfinger, he says, do you expect me to talk? And Goldfinger says, no, Mr. Bond, I expect you to die. And Caleb's like shaking next to me, and he's like, Daddy, does James Bond die? And I point at the rest of the box set. We've got the DVDs. There are kind of like 15 films to come. I say, what do you think? Have a look at the book. What do you think? And the resurrection means that there is hope of life beyond the grave. The resurrection means that we know how the story ends. Billy Graham says famously, I've read the last page of the Bible. It all turns out all right in the end. And the resurrection's a kind of spoiler of what is to come. We can rise again because Jesus rose again. That event in history is a preview of our future. Jesus' story is our destiny. Because his grave is empty, so can ours be. And I guess I wanted to finish our time together just by thinking about so you started with some verses from the Bible there, but I'd like to finish with some really where all of us will know people who've died. All of us will at one point or another contemplate death. And the Bible tells us to encourage one another with talk about our future. And so these verses say this: brothers and sisters, we do not want you to be informed about those who sleep in death, so that you do not grieve like the rest of mankind who have no hope. For we believe that Jesus died and rose again. And so we believe that God will bring with Jesus those who have fallen asleep in him. Therefore, encourage one another with these words. Jesus is alive. It means that we know we are loved beyond our wildest expectations. It means we can have hope for the future. Happy Easter.
Happy Easter. What a beautiful place to finish, Phil. Thank you so much for spending some of your evening with us on the Lifecentral podcast. It's been so encouraging. It's been so interesting to explore this content with you. And listeners, I hope that this episode has been really helpful for you. I hope it's encouraged your curiosity. I hope it's just encouraged you in general, but maybe even it's given you some confidence to just have those conversations with the people that you know who don't yet know Jesus. Easter is almost here and it's absolutely time to celebrate. Phil, thanks so much for coming. I really appreciate it. We'll see you next month, I guess, everyone, for another episode of the Lifecentral podcast. But until then, ta-ra,